the psychoanalytic theory tries to approach literary texts from a psychological point of view, particularly psychoanalytic point of view. So now that you have a very good idea of psychoanalysis and the model of the human mind according to psychoanalysis and the types of behavior exhibited at frustration, you can apply that to a text. But how are you going to go about doing that? How do you apply this theory, literary theory, to a text? And when I ask you this question, how do you apply this literary theory, the psychoanalytic theory, to a text, I mean, what are the steps you follow? And what's the purpose of that application? Before you follow the steps, you have to identify the purpose of this application. You ask yourself, why am I applying the psychoanalytic theory to this text? So why do I apply, what's the answer to this question? Why am I applying the you ask yourself, why am I applying this theory to this text? All criticism aims at showing a kind of value, some sort of value. So it's all about value. You're showing the value of something. I'm answering the question about the purpose of applying the psychoanalysis. Actually, this is the purpose of applying any theory to a text, not necessarily. So you always ask yourself the same question. Why am I applying this theory to this text, whatever the theory is? So why are you applying this theory to the text? It could be, of course, it's to show value. What kind of value? For example, let's start with the most irrelevant value. To us, it's the most irrelevant. You would like to reinforce a particular concept in psychology. You like to reinforce. What's the meaning of reinforce? To emphasize, to support, to prove that a particular concept in psychology is valid. So you're trying to show the validity of a psychological concept by applying it to literature. In other words, let me put it as simple as possible. This is a psychological concept taken from psychology, and this is a literary text. I want to prove that this concept is valid, is right. So I apply it to this text to show that it is valid, it's correct. To show what is correct, this psychological concept. But why did I call this irrelevant in our field? Because we are we're not majoring in psychology, right? We are majoring in literature. Because you're majoring in literature, your job is not to prove the validity of a psychological concept or a philosophical concept or whatever. Who would do that? Psychologists would do that. Right? Psychologists would do. Why do psychologists study literature? Psychologists study literature in order to show the validity of psychological concepts. Why do you think Freud studied literature? It was not because his aim was not oriented by the literary texts. He was not thinking of literary texts. He was thinking of his patients. He was thinking of psychology. So this is one purpose of applying the psychoanalytic theory to literature. Another purpose is to examine the author's mind. You need to examine the author's personality, the author's mind, the author's behavior. So what do? You study the literary text that has been produced by that mind. So if I take a novel written by Hemingway, and if I apply the literary theory, this theory, the psychoanalytic theory, to it, in other words, I'm doing what? I'm examining the mind of Ernest Hemingway. If I take a novel written by Virginia Woolf and examine it psychoanalytically, then I am examining the personality of Virginia Woolf. The purpose here is to examine the author's mind. By studying their works, you are studying their character, their personality, right? Another purpose is to examine the characters inside the literary text. Because those literary texts, those novels, have characters in them. So I want to examine the characters. I don't care about the author. I care about the characters. Now, but there's a question there. I mean, why study characters? They are just figures on the page. They don't exist in reality. Why am I examining their personality? Because the author is trying to convey some kind of lesson. Every text communicates a kind of lesson in one way or another. So what is the lesson? And by lesson here, I don't mean the moral lesson. I'm not talking about the didacticism, because we're focusing on psychology. So that lesson is a psychological lesson. It's a lesson in behavior, probably. It could be a lesson to parents. The author is giving the parents a lesson on how to treat their kids, how to raise their kids. For example, like if you don't do this to your kid, this is what's going to happen to your children in the future. And another purpose is simply to shed further light on the text itself. This is another purpose. Like, I want to sharpen your understanding about this text. I want to shed further light on this text. Why? To show the value of this text. Every text is a work of art. It has intrinsic value. And sometimes you want to show the value of a particular text. And this is, it's commonplace in criticism and in art, that you want to show the value of a particular artistic product. It could be a painting, it could be a literary text, it could be anything, a vase, for example, anything, any artistic work. By approaching the text from a different perspective, you shed further light on it, and its value increases. Right? Its value increases. This is another purpose. To show the value of the text, to shed further light on the text. Another purpose, you might be surprised, but it's true. It's just because you like to do it for fun. You enjoy it. You enjoy analyzing. You've heard of this movement, the aesthetic movement, called art for art's sake. Art for the sake of art. Art for the sake of art means art serves no purpose but itself. You enjoy art. art for the sake of art. There's no other sake for art. So we have criticism for the sake of criticism. Criticism for the sake of criticism. You enjoy engaging in critical work. You like to analyze, you enjoy analyzing, and you write an essay just because you like to write an essay. You enjoy analyzing a particular text. Criticism for the sake of criticism. Another purpose is it's part of your work and your study program. It's an assignment, for example. It has been assigned to you, like your professors ask you to write an essay, so you have to do it. This is not the best of purposes, but it's a purpose, right? It's a purpose. So these are the reasons why we apply literary theories in general to a text, not necessarily the psychoanalytic theory. After you identify your purpose, after you answer this question, why am I applying the psychoanalytic theory to this particular text? Now you have the answer, you can start on the right foot. Now you won't feel lost because you have defined your purpose, your goal. Once your goal is set and clear, then the way is definitely clear. So now we come to the steps of application. After identifying your purpose, you have to follow the steps of application. What are you going to do? You have all the principles we studied in psychoanalysis, the structure of the human mind, the id, the ego, the superego, and the interrelationship among the id, how they function and collaborate together. You also have the types of behavior we discussed. So all you have to do is to apply these principles to the text. For example, you want to apply this theory to characters in a novel. You're not going to apply these principles to all the characters in the novel, not even all the major characters, because that's going to be a huge project for you. So you shouldn't bite off more than you can chew. You have to single out a specific character. For example, take the protagonist, the hero, the character of the protagonist, and then examine the character of the protagonist in the light of the principles you have studied. What are you going to establish? You examine that character. How? Let's take, for example, the types of behavior. We said those are types of behavior exhibited at frustration of particular drives. So you ask yourself, what are the needs or drives of this character, of the protagonist? You list those needs. Which drive is frustrated? There must be one or more frustrated drives. Identify those drives. When that drive is frustrated, what is this protagonist going to do? Which type of behavior is he going to engage in? Is it going to be compensation? Is it going to be aggression? What kind of behavior does he display? Let's suppose he's a male protagonist. And if it's compensation, is it negative or positive compensation? Of course, when you examine these things, when you answer these questions, your answers are based on what? They are based on what? On textual evidence. On textual evidence. What does that mean? It means you you have to show from the text that your ideas are valid. Like, this character has a frustrated drive. Which drive is it? Let's say the need for money, for example, or protection. It's not enough to say that. You have to show it. Prove it. You have to bring evidence from the text to show that. You have to bring evidence from the text and write it down in order to show this. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, how are you going to bring evidence? What kind of evidence? You will say, what kind of evidence should I extract from the text and write it down? Well, it's either what the character does. The protagonist in the novel, the protagonist says a lot of things, right? So you take this evidence from his speech, what he says. Or the protagonist's behavior, right? The protagonist's behavior. So what the character does, character's behavior. You take that behavior, single it out, because it proves your point, and you write it down. And the evidence comes from what other characters say about this character. What other character are other? He's not the only character in the novel. There are other characters. What do they say about him? If another character says, yes, he needs money. Oh, this is evidence. It shows that this drive is frustrated. So you take that speech made by another character and put it in your paper as evidence that that drive has been frustrated. Evidence also comes from what the narrator or the author says about that character, right? Yeah. Evidence comes from what the author himself says about that character, or the narrator in the novel. And it could be, what the author says about that protagonist could not be stated in the novel itself. It could be in an interview with the author. Somebody makes an interview with the author and asks him, what do you think about this protagonist in your novel? He says, well, I think he needs money. Okay? That's evidence. This evidence comes, it's extra textual evidence. It's outside the text, but it's evidence. The author said that. Evidence also comes from what critics said about this novel. So you have to check other books written by other critics, or research papers, or other students who wrote theses and dissertations about this novel, previous studies. So you take that's also evidence, you bring it here. So you're acting like a lawyer in a court, right? It's like a legal case, and you have to prove a point. So you gather all this evidence and put it where? In your paper. To show that this character is suffering from frustration. Okay? Now you will say, how do I put this in my paper? Well, there are ways to put that in the paper. It could be a quotation. It could be a direct quotation. Like you're quoting what the character says. You take the speech as it is and put it in your paper, a quotation. It could be a quotation from the protagonist's speech, from another character's speech, from the author's speech, from the narrator's speech. It could be in the form of a paraphrase. Like the character says something, you don't have to take it directly and put it here. You can paraphrase what he said. He says blah, blah, blah. Okay? So this is reported speech, indirect speech. If they are events, you can quote them, but we seldom quote events. We usually just summarize events. We just summarize and say what happened in our own words. But remember, please, whenever evidence you take from the novel or from another source and place it in your paper, there should be a citation or a reference. You have to say where you took this from the novel itself. If it's from the novel, where, which page, which chapter. If it's from another source, what page. And you provide all the publication details, information about it. Otherwise, it would be considered plagiarism. Then again, this is frustration. Then what kind of reaction did this protagonist adopt? What was his reaction?
Negative.
For example, negative or positive. It could be positive, it could be negative. Which type of behavior? Is it aggression? Is it withdrawal? What kind of behavior? You remember those types of behavior we discussed in the video. But again, where do you get your ideas from? Again, from all of these sources. So whatever you say, it should be taken from sources. Like he exhibited withdrawal. Was it negative withdrawal or positive withdrawal? For example, it was negative withdrawal. How? Well, you have to show it. Again, you go back to the protagonist's speech, take extracts from that, other characters, what he does, what the author says about him, what the narrator says about him, what the critics say about him, and put it there. So now if you're thinking about it, if you think about it, you will say, oh my God, this means I'm going to write a lot, right? Yes, and that's why I said you cannot really analyze all the characters in a novel. Even analyzing 2 characters in a novel would be too much. So one character, like the protagonist, that would be enough. So you have a lot to write about. After you provide all the evidence, you just synthesize that at the end with a conclusion. Okay, after I analyzed this character, then what's my conclusion? Well, your conclusion grows from your purpose. You remember, that's why we said you have to identify your purpose. Are you trying to prove the validity of a particular psychoanalytic concept? Are you going to study the mind of the author? Is your research oriented towards the characterization? Is it to show the intrinsic value of a particular text? This is what you have to state in your conclusion. Okay, so this is the process of application. And what I said today does not only apply to the psychoanalytic theory, it applies actually to any theory you wish to apply to a text, to any text. Thank you very much for your attendance, and see you next week.